And you're joining me again, Andrew Eborn, with my very special guest, Philip Mantle. And we were talking last time, Philip, about how you would question everything. When you were working in the factory and you were told by your boss, wait 17 seconds before doing this, you said, well, why 17 seconds? And you were the first person ever in the whole history of working on that factory floor to question why you should do that.
Well, it just kind of made sense to me, Andrew. That's the way I'd always been, you know, and just ask. I mean, my mum always said, you know, whenever you've got a tongue in your mouth, you'll never get lost, you know. So it's the same kind of thing. If you want to know something, just ask. And most of the time, the person you ask will tell you what you're trying to find out. And it's the same thing. Even today, I mean, I was asked not that long ago, how do you find out all this information, Philip? I just ask, you know, just ask a simple question. And it's amazing when you do that, what you can find out, of course.
That's right. I mean, we touched on last time about a lot of people come from their own particular belief. And I will often say on this program that in the same way as we consume the news, most people will have a certain belief and they never, ever, ever divert from that belief. So they will get newspapers that confirm those views. They'll tune into TV channels that do that. They'll listen to people. They'll have little communities on Facebook and so on and so forth, because they're searching for confirmation of their beliefs. Yes. Rather than doing what I always encourage people, and what you clearly do as well, is to question everything. So when we look at things, and I encourage our children, I encourage everybody, when you're looking at the news, don't just look at the BBC, look at ITV, look at Fox, look at Russia Today, get your news from Al Jazeera, because the truth is out there, but it's not going to come from one source.
Well, that's correct. I mean, if you get it from one source, it's like newspapers, they're all biased in one form or another, you know. And I've often said the only thing you should believe about a newspaper is the date and the price on it. And you should check that a couple of times as well, you know. I was
involved. I had to tell you, Philip, I was involved in the price wars with the newspapers. So I can tell you the prices, when they say half the price of this, if it wasn't half the price, they got into trouble. So you're right. Even that you should question. But it is interesting, as I say, the whole mindset thing. And I mentioned last time briefly about Nick Pope. Now, Nick Pope, I actually went to school with, a place called Lord Wandsworth College. And Nick, as you know him very well in this community. For 21 years or so, he worked for the Ministry of Defence. But for 3 or 4 of those years, he worked in their UFO division. And his job was effectively to have a look, and this is what he'll tell you, to have a look at all those unidentified stories. What do you know about Nick?
Well, I know Nick, you know, fairly well. Still in communication with him, although he lives in the States now, mainly about football rather than UFOs, because unfortunately he supports Arsenal and I don't, but we won't hold that against him.
But, who do you support? Who do you support?
Manchester United, of course.
There you go.
And from 1991 for 3 years, Nick served at a department called Air Staff, and part of his job, and only a very small part of his job, Andrew, was dealing with UFO correspondence, either from the public or ministers or members of parliament or whoever. So no, Nick didn't run, as he likes to say, the British government's UFO project, simply because there wasn't one, and Nick at that time never ran anything. He was the only one in the department. I think he shared an administration person with someone else, but it was only a small part of his job. He handled low flying complaints and all this kind of thing as well. He would prepare press statements for, you know, members of parliament, but it was only a small part of his job. So there was no UFO project. I know that because I used to contact Nick at the time, and he was very helpful. Don't get me wrong. His predecessor would just send you out the standard letter, and that was it. All that would change probably on it is who they were writing to and the date, but it was the same letter that sent to everybody. Nick was very cooperative as far as he could go, you know. And then, of course, whoever took over from Nick reverted back to his predecessor, who just sent you the standard letter.
And what was the standard letter? When, I mean, you must have received a number.
Standard letter was, thank you very much for the inquiry. You know, we're sorry we can't help you. We don't have a department that deals specifically with UFOs, you know.
So just to be clear on this then, Philip, and I'll speak to Nick, and that's what I always love doing on this program is getting lots of people's views. And then we'll get, if they're not in the room to counteract that, we can speak to them directly about it or see what they would say. You're saying there was never, ever, ever a department that looked at UFOs?
No, I'm saying that Nick Pope never, ever worked in a department that studied UFOs.
Okay. So Nick, you say Nick didn't, but was there a department that studied UFOs?
The only official UFO study that was ever released by the Ministry of Defense is called the Condign Report. Came out, I don't know, early part of the 2000s.
And that refers to what happened in August 1990. Oh no, it's the Calvine, isn't it? That sort of sign.
No, that's a totally separate. It's called the Condign Report.
Condign Report, yes.
I can't remember the name of the chap who wrote it, but
probably Condign, Mr. Condign.
No, it wasn't. He was a professor, and he worked for Defense Intelligence 55. So his department was DI 55. And when you look at the correspondence that Nick would have, when he ever corresponded with anybody, he had a list of people it was carbon copied to. One of those departments was DI 55.
So DI 55. So what was the remit of, and it's important to make sure that all the I's are separated. So Calvine, which we'll come on to, that's a different thing, August 1990, and Klondine.
Klondine, yeah.
Klondine is what you're saying. That was the department. So what was their remit?
Their remit was to look at the information that they'd studied, and come to a conclusion. They came to the conclusion that UFOs were not extraterrestrial, were not secret government, aircraft. They were in fact, plasma. And they used the phrase that the Americans are now using, a UAP, unidentified atmospheric phenomena. It's something that had been used in UFO research for decades, but never mind. And they came to the conclusion that we're looking like a still unknown form of natural phenomena. It had been studied before. It's loosely termed earth lights. For example, when there's an earthquake, sometimes there'll be a blanket of lights in the sky. These are like the small cousins of the mountains and the earthquake lights. So it's balls of plasma. It's not ball lightning, but it's balls of plasma that's given off when rocks are under pressure. That can be under pressure from fault lines or there's a thing called mountaintop discharge where it can be emitted from, or there may be a large body of water there that's putting pressure on the rocks beneath, and hey presto, what you see is lights. But of course, when we see these strange lights, that's when our bias comes into play. Our belief system comes into play. And when I say we, I don't mean necessarily you and I mean we as a species will sometimes interpret that as something entirely different.
Oh, no, I understand that. And again, it goes back to the belief systems where if you're convinced of something, just as we talked about in the last episode about your mother convinced of the fairies, you basically will turn around and look for evidence which will support that belief. But just going back, just to be absolutely clear on this, because Nick I've known for a long time, and Nick, he's now in Tucson, Arizona. That's where he's based.
Yes.
He absolutely is out there telling the world that for 2 or 3 years, he was part of this UFO project, if you like.
No, he says he ran the British government's UFO project, and that is not correct.
Okay.
Only a small part of his job was handling UFO inquiries from members of the public and elsewhere. There was no official government UFO project. There was that one
And the
study.
people would focus in on that word. So you said there was no official government project.
Official, unofficial, call it what you will.
There wasn't any project. Was there a project at all, official or unofficial?
No, there was no UFO project.
No project at all.
No, I mean, Nick's grade, I believe at the time was the second lowest from the bottom that you could get in the Ministry of Defence. So he wasn't qualified to run anything. He was just up from being a clerk. You know, I'm not saying that in any way. It's just a fact, you know. And he went on to do other things thereafter, you know, non-UFO related, and spent 21 years working at the Ministry of Defence. But he didn't run any UFO project officially, unofficially. He didn't investigate UFOs for the Ministry of Defence. He never left his office, you know. He handled inquiries as they came in from the general public.
So, but handling inquiries. So let's put it this way, because you said you wrote or you corresponded with him at that time. You're still in touch with him, even though you support different football teams, Man United versus Arsenal. Clearly, there's some sort of relationship going on there where you're talking about UFOs.
Yes.
So talk to me about some of that correspondence then, and why would it land on his desk?
Well, that was the department that dealt with it. It was called Air Staff 2A, and it was only part of their remit. I actually have a copy of the job description that Nick did, because it was, the way we got that is some chap wrote in and said, can I have the job? You know, I'd love to be the government's UFO guy. Can I get? And they said, no, the way we do it is we actually, you know, we advertise these positions like many others internally. So they're filled from an internal pool of employees. And they sent him the job description, which was, you know, and the job grade, you know, as well. And the salary. The salary wasn't exact. It was from this to this. It could be anywhere in between that. And this was what the job was. And part of that job, although it didn't say in this, these were the skills that were required for it, only a small part of it was dealing with UFOs. All right. The rest was something else.
So it's a fair comment then. What I like to do is work out the bits which people agree on, and we can work out the bits they disagree on and try to come to some sort of conclusion. But the bits that you agree on, there was some part of the job that related to investigating UFOs.
Not investigating, no. Dealing with UFO inquiries. They're entirely different. Okay. You know, I would write to Nick and say, we had a sighting at York, you know, at X location on this date. Do you know anything about it? Have you had any other reports on that particular date? And his predecessors would just give you the same. We don't follow you. We don't investigate UFOs. We don't have any information. You know, Nick, to his credit, would try and be more helpful. So he would look if they had any other sightings on that date, and if they did, he would release that information, redacted, of course, with the people's names and addresses and so on. So he was more helpful, but that was him as a person, not his job description. There was nobody, he didn't have a boss saying, you've got to do it this way, you've got to be more helpful. That was just down to Nick, you know, because he is a very nice guy. You know, I'll be the first to say that. And he was more cooperative. But then as soon as he'd finished, and the next person took over, it was back to square one again. You know, she didn't want to be particularly helpful. Why, UFOs, I'll just send them that letter. Here we go, you know, and that was it, you know. So it was more helpful, but that's about it.
And so part of it, and just being abundantly clear on this then, is really this is just dealing with your so what was the job description? It's dealing with the public for inquiries about. Yeah,
he dealt with public inquiries, like I would write to him, or you may contact him and said, I made this sighting on such and such. There was a time, of course, when if you wanted to report a UFO sighting to the Ministry of Defence, they would acknowledge that they'd received it. But then they send you out a letter, and it actually gave you the contact details of, I think, 2 or 3 civilian UFO groups for you to contact about your sighting. One of them was the one I was a member of, and it used to have my telephone number on, So the Ministry of Defence were telling you, we're not interested, basically, but they're telling you in a very nice way. So, but these organisations may well be able to help you. There's the contact details.
So to be abundantly clear then on this, is what you're saying is that Nick didn't run a UFO project for the Ministry of Defence. Is that right?
Correct. Okay. Correct.
And there wasn't, taking it one step further, there wasn't a project at all, whether official, unofficial, or any other things.
Not that we know of. They did that one study, but they called Project Condign. And as far as we're aware, you can go back to the 1950s. There was such a thing then called the Flying Saucer Working Party, in a little office somewhere in Westminster. And they came to the same conclusions as their American counterparts in 1950s, that it was all nonsense, but that's way back when. All those people are long since gone. We're talking about modern times. There was that one study, as far as we're aware, and that was it.
Well, I mentioned briefly about Calvine and the incident that happened, not to confuse people with the other report, but Calvine, which happened in August 1990, which was a sighting. And Nick has reported, I believe it's in The Sun, only a couple of days ago. Talk to me then about that and why that would have come across his desk.
Well, Calvine is a place. It's in Scotland somewhere. And I think it was first covered by one of the newspapers in Scotland. Someone had contacted them, said they'd been out and about, and they had taken this photograph in broad daylight, in a scenic area. And what you see is a huge sort of diamond-shaped object. And in the distance behind it are two RAF fighter jets. And it is alleged that there were, I believe, 6 photographs in total. And they were sent to the department in which Nick works. He wasn't in it at that point. He wasn't there at that time. And have a look at these and the negatives. And of course, there was a file on it. Nick says when he took over, there was actually a large sort of enlargement of this photograph on his, I don't know whether he put it on his office door or someone had put it on his office door, and it stayed there. And at some point, somebody took it down and never saw it again.
Well, it's rather similar to Fox Mulder, and he's been compared to Fox Mulder for the reasons that we went to. And in Fox Mulder's office, there was a big picture of a UFO, which underneath it said, "I want to believe."
Yeah.
And so that was his moment when he had this, as you say, this shaped object in the air. He wanted to have that similar thing, but it was an actual picture, because most of the sightings, and we'll come on to this, most of the sightings, he says in the piece, would be fuzzy or indistinct, or you can't really make anything out. This, he says, is a very, very clear photograph of an unidentified flying object in the sky. Yeah. And as I understand it, I'm only regurgitating, I'm not there firsthand, so it's only what I have read. As I understand it, that photograph was due to be released in the new year. But we have now found out that for whatever reason, it's being suppressed for another 50 years. Is that right?
That's the story, yes, yes. And of course, when Nick looked in one of the files, all you see is a poor quality photocopy of it. And I know there's a number of researchers tried to find the actual photographers. I think it was the Scottish Daily Record that may have run it originally. So they've gone to them, and of course they don't have to keep records as a newspaper as such. So the witnesses have never been interviewed, as far as we're aware. Nobody knows who they are, and it is an enigma. There's lots of theories as such. Perhaps this was some kind of experimental aircraft, that they happened across that day. Who knows? But of course, if Nick had been the head of the MOD's UFO department or UFO project, well, surely he could have just opened the file and had a look at it himself, but that's not the case, is it? So
he says in the report, I mean, as I say, I haven't spoken to Nick directly about it because the newspaper report's only just come out, but he'll be back on the show. He's been on the show already. And I'll put to him that the points that you make, and maybe we'll get the two of you together. I think that'd be fantastic. Get a Man United supporter with an Arsenal supporter. That'll be an interesting discussion. But the other thing is exactly, he says that the reason it's suppressed is because it may have been an American secret aircraft, and people didn't want to release that information. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, it is indeed. I mean, what we have to remember is that all governments keep secrets. It's their job to keep secrets, and we would be snookered if they didn't keep secrets. So sometimes there is reasons why things are kept, secret. And of course, if you tell people why it's secret, then you're actually giving the game away. So it's likely to be something along those lines. A lot of documents, of course, it's not the content that is secret. And I'm not talking about this one in particular. I'm talking about in general terms. It's the data gathering that is the secret part of it. The channels that they've gone down in the first instance to obtain this information. The information at the end of the day may be very mundane, but it's how you actually got hold of it in the first place is the secret bit. So if you were to release the documents, you would release your data gathering sources. So that's another reason for keeping documents secret. Not in this instance, of course, because we know the story behind it. It was actually sent in by members of the public, So there may well be a perfectly valid reason why that's not being released. We'll have to wait and see if that can be overturned, because you can appeal that decision. And I believe that's what's already happening. I think Nick mentioned it briefly in his article. This particular photograph has been written about before, Andrew. It's nothing new. It's new to a lot of people, but it's nothing new. And it will be interesting to see how it develops and whether
I always say, Philip, that what happens is history repeats itself, and you see a pattern. And the way that the conspiracy theorists get worked up, and people who have a certain belief get worked up, is if there's suppressed information, because they will then turn around and say, that must confirm that our view is correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
yes.
And it happened, we're going to come on to Roswell in another episode about that sort of stuff, when you have a report that first of all, something's a flying saucer, and then all of a sudden a bit later, oh no, it's an air balloon, a weather balloon. And then all of a sudden, when you change the story or you suppress information, all of the people who have a certain belief will turn around and say, well, of course they're going to say that. They're hiding something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they could well be hiding something, but they could well have a perfectly good reason for hiding it in the first place. As we said, it's the nature of government to keep secrets. Some of them are a bit silly, but ours is covered by, the Official Secrets Act, which is very outdated. I believe that the current version was brought in for the First World War. Well, a lot of things have changed since then. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine used to work in a textile mill, and he had to sign the Official Secrets Act. And I said, oh, I don't believe, get out. He says, no, he says, we actually make cloth for military dress uniforms. So as a result, I am not allowed to tell you what that cloth's made of. It's just cloth, but it just happens to be used for military dress uniforms. And he had to sign the Official Secrets Act. So, there are times when it's a nonsense as well, but we have to realize there are other occasions when there's a very valid reason for it. But like you said, all it does in instances like this is fuel the conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and again, we're going to look at that in the next episode when we come on to the alien autopsy and Roswell and so on and so forth. But just for the purposes of this episode, and to be absolutely clear, looking at it, Nick would say, I guess, that the very fact that inquiries about UFOs end up on his desk means, with maybe a bit of artistic license, you could say that if there were a UFO inquiry, it would find its way to Nick, which is why he responded to you. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, he did. He responded to all the inquiries that came across his desk, but we have to remember that was only a small part of what he did. You know,
Right.
he did a lot of other stuff that had nothing to do with UFOs. It was only a
Sure.
small part, and
But
he did not run any government UFO project.
yeah, because your point is there was no such project, official or unofficial.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
this is inquiries, mainly from members of the public, probably only from members of the public, to unidentified happenings. Is that fair?
Yeah, Nick may have to write briefings for members of parliament if there was going to be a discussion about certain things on the topic, which there was from time to time. And he may give write an internal briefing or that kind of thing. But yeah, that's all it was.
Okay. So what was his job description then? What was his job that those inquiries would land on his desk?
Well, it was just up from a clerk. The job advertisement was very much clerical duties, you know, and Nick will tell you, I mean, he never left his office. So he didn't get his briefcase with his MOD ID and say, right, I'm off to speak to the people who've taken these photographs at Calvine, and I'm going to go see them on behalf of the Minister of Defence. We want to know more. And that never happened. You know, he never left his office. So by the very nature of what we're describing, it is clerical work. You know, it is office based. That's it.
My understanding, talking with Nick, is he would say that part of his job was to investigate those claims. Is that fair?
No, not at all. Nick did not investigate UFOs on behalf of the Ministry of Defence. He did it on behalf of Nick Pope. As I've said, Nick was very helpful, you know, but he didn't have to. I think there's one of the documents we have in our collection that one of his superiors saying that Nick went over and above his remit, you know. So while
you have, I mean, I'm sure you've got letters still, Philip, but when you receive the response, are you receiving them from the MOD or from Nick Pope?
From the Ministry of Defence.
So what authority would he have to use Ministry of Defence paper to respond to you?
Well, that was part of his job, you know. So this, you know, I would write to Nick, you know, at Air Staff 2A at Whitehall and say, have you got any details of this? And he would write back and say, yes, I have, no, I haven't. But then there would always be the caveat that the Ministry of Defence, you know, takes no formal part, you know, we have no fixed, we don't believe in extraterrestrials, no government defence, no interest, you know. So Nick would add his own little chapter in there somewhere, but the rest of it would be the standard information that you get from anybody else.
So the procedure, I'm trying to think, and maybe the best thing is next time we'll bring up a real example, but a member of the public writes into the Ministry of Defence, somehow, even though there's not a department, said they've seen something in the sky, triangular thing in the sky, can't explain it. They write to the Ministry of Defence saying, we've seen this, here's a picture of it, what is it? Somehow that letter lands on Nick's desk,
yeah,
for whatever reason. Are you saying he doesn't investigate it at all? Or he just sends off the standard letter, or does he at least go and see what's happening and give some sort of response?
It all depended on Nick. You know, he never left his desk to do any investigating. Let's put it that way. So Nick, like I said, his predecessor would just send you out the standard letter and you would just bang your head against the wall. You wouldn't get any information. Nick would go out of his way to try and help you, you know, but that was Nick's decision. This wasn't, you know, on his job description saying you have to investigate UFOs, you have to do this, you have to do that. That was Nick's decision. And like I said, one of the letters I've read from the Ministry of Defence, not from Nick himself, but someone else, said that Nick went over and above the remit of his duties. So in other words, he was very helpful, but he didn't have to be. He could have just sent you the same standard letter that his predecessor had to, but Nick's a nicer guy. He perhaps had garnered an interest by working there, or maybe something else triggered his interest, you know, and he thought, well, I'll try and be as helpful as I can.
Sure.
You know,
but by being helpful, as I say, going back to your categorical statement beforehand that he didn't investigate anything, in order to, I'm just trying to think of it logically, he receives, for whatever reason, it lands on his desk. There's no department is what you say, but it lands on his desk because he's communicating with the public. he then must have, in order to write the response being helpful, looked into that claim and say, well, hang about, there was a weather balloon there at that time, or this was.
I think he did that on occasion, but not all the time, because most of the time you'd be asking if he had any other sightings on that particular date or in this location, you know, because we know when someone makes an observation, more often than not, there are others in the locale or, you know, nearby would also. So his inquiries would be many and varied, not necessarily saying, I want you to investigate this. Like I said, the way we found his job description, because somebody wrote in and said, how do I apply to get the job? You know, so not only did they explain how they, you know, promote internally, but they actually sent the job description to this gentleman, you know, and it is basically clerical work. It got the nickname, the UFO desk, but it was purely a nickname. You wouldn't have knocked on Nick's door and it had UFO desk on the outside of it, you know, or UFO project or whatever. It was just part of the MOD. But like I said, he dealt with many other different types of inquiries of nothing related to UFOs at all. So this was only a small part of his duties.
So just to be clear, then, what was his title and what was his remit?
He's told me his title, but I can't remember it off the top of my head, Andrew, to be perfectly honest. I haven't got the documents here. I think it was something like an executive officer. I think that's something like the title of his job description, but doesn't really tell you anything. You know, a friend of mine, for example, used to call himself a local government officer, which he was. He worked for the local government. He worked for Leeds City Council, but he was a parking meter attendant. but he was indeed a local government officer, you know, and his remit happened to be parking meter attendant.
So are you saying, to be fair, and we will put this to Nick, but are you saying that Nick is using a bit of artistic license?
I would say more than a bit, but good luck to him, you know, why not?
When you as a Man United supporter speak to him as an Arsenal supporter, do you address this directly with him?
I pity him, really. You know, he can't help it. He must have been something in the water when he was a child that brought him to be an Arsenal supporter, you know. So I like Nick. We are good friends. We have difference of opinions. He knows my opinion on this. It's not anything secret. It's not something I often talk about. But like I said, most of our communication nowadays is to do with football. And at times it's far more interesting as well.
I know, but it's interesting because it's not. This is one of these things which is not an opinion. This is a statement of fact, which is why it's so easy when we're drilling down. This is what I love about this series, and this is why it's so helpful talking to you and talking to Nick directly. In the same ways when we talk, we come on to Spears and Ray a little bit later. It's interesting to get both sides, and just as you with your 17-second rule and question everything when you're working in the factory and say why do that. This is not about an opinion. This is a statement of fact. And Nick is saying that he ran, a bit of artistic license maybe, he ran the UFO project. You're saying there was no such project. What you had was a job maybe which meant that any inquiries from the public would end up on your desk. And as part of that, they might say there's a strange thing in the sky. What was it? Nick might go a bit further than his predecessor and say, well, let me have a look, or it was a weather balloon, or I'm not quite sure, there's no reports on it, and that was it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty much, yeah. He was Nixon, like I said, Nick's a nice guy, and he was very helpful when he could be. And he still is to this very day, you know. And like I said, being an Arsenal fan, I won't hold that against him, you know.
If I were to write, I'm sure there are people who write nowadays, having had their sightings, to the MOD. Is there a successor to Nick? Is there somebody?
No, it closed down. That particular office, that particular department closed. I think it was 2009.
Right.
And there'd been a concerted effort down the years to get access to all the UFO files. And that was led by mainly Dr. David Clark from Sheffield Hallam University. And eventually they were succeeded. All the UFO files were released to the National Archives at Kew. So you can get some of them online. Some of the older ones are the old full scap size papers. So they've not been scanned in, so you literally have to make an appointment and go there and to view them, or you can buy them. They'll print them out, but they're not cheap. And if you write to them now, they'll say, sorry, we no longer are interested. Thank you very much.
But again, just to be fair, then the fact that there are something called the UFO files would suggest that somebody was compiling those files, and if that person was Nick, then you can understand how the description could come about.
Yeah, they are the UFO files. When you go through them, Andrew, most of them are not about UFOs at all. It's the internal correspondence, passing it from one person to another, and they will perhaps have a briefing or a description of a letter, and they'll pass that to someone else. I'm going to send this to so-and-so, just check that this is right. So a lot of it is just dross, but there are sightings in there. I mean, no, some of them are quite interesting. A lot of them are not. There are no smoking guns, unfortunately. There are interesting things that are not in there, that you think, well, where did that go?
And that's the one, going back to our point beforehand, because people will focus on either the cover-ups or the changed stories or the missing stories. Which are the ones which are missing?
A very famous incident took place in the late 70s in Todmorden in West Yorkshire, involving police constable Alan Godfrey. He was working his last night, he was working night shift in the patrol car on his own, and he'd actually been looking for some cows that had gone astray. And it'd been raining during the night. PC Godfrey thought, nearly finished my night shift. He'd spoken to a foot patrol officer in the town. I'll have one last look for these cows, and then I'm done. So he's driving up the main street through Todmorden, and up ahead he sees a light. And as he gets closer, he said, it's not just the light, it's this spinning top, the old-fashioned spinning top, blocking the road. It's not quite on the tarmac, but it's not far off. It's got a bank of black panels or windows across the top, and the bottom part is rotating. And so Alan Godfrey gets on the radio to the police station, can't get through. So like any officer, he gets his notepad out, starts to draw this thing. The next thing he knows, he's several hundred yards beyond where it had been, now driving the patrol car. No recollection of doing that. He turned around, this thing had gone, but the tarmac where it had been was dry. Bearing in mind it had been raining that night. He went back to the police station. He was 15, 20 minutes late than he should have been. He reported the incident. He also, when he was getting changed, noticed he had a little burn on the instep of his foot, and his police boot was split. And I think it was a day or two later, Alan was asked to write an official report, and that was sent to the Ministry of Defence, and there's no sign of it. What he didn't put in the report is the fact that 6 months later, Alan went under regressive hypnosis. Two professional psychiatrists were employed to do the work, and they took him back to the time, and Alan, claims that he was abducted by aliens and he saw these strange creatures and so on. And I've seen the hypnosis tape, and it is fascinating. And if you meet Alan, he received commendations for his police work. Back in those days, it was a no-nonsense policeman. He's the kind of chap, I think, if he'd have seen you doing something silly, he would have just told you off, but you didn't really want to cross him. And but his report is not there. It's not.
Why do you think that is? Because that's when suspicions get aroused. Why?
Well, who knows? I mean, this is a paper file, and it's sent. Who knows? It could still be there, but it's in some other file. I find stuff in. I still have an old-fashioned filing cabinet here with all kinds of bits of paper in it, and I still find stuff in there I never knew I had. And mine's only small. So there is the chance of human error. It's gone somewhere else. Or, for example, we've learned in this last couple of years that the United States Department of Defense had been running a secret UFO study program. And it only came out in 2017 when the head of that program, a chap by the name of Louis Elizondo, stepped forward and said, this is what I did, and released some information and some videos. But we never knew anything about it. So, you know, it's a fair question to say, well, have we had some kind of secret UFO study that even Nick's not aware of? Because at that time when he was there, he was only second up on the rung of the ladder as far as the grading was concerned. It's a valid question. There's no proof that we have, of course. And then there's one from the 1960s, an old chap I spoke to. He was called Wing Commander Alan Turner, MBE. And the Wing Commander's security clearance was so high that when the spy plane, you know, the U-2 came into Britain to refuel, he was notified. And that was the most secret aircraft in the world at the time. So he was on duty, and he captured on military radar 6 unidentified targets over mainland Britain. He confirmed it with other radar stations and Heathrow. He immediately phoned the Ministry of Defence, who ordered, not requested, ordered him to make a full report there and then, which he did. And you can't find that anywhere in the Ministry of Defence files. I've met Wing Commander Turner in person. You know, he's not interested in UFOs. He will tell me what these things weren't. You know, it weren't planets, satellites, aircraft, you know, balloons, I mean, birds, you name it. But he's no idea what they were, you know. But that's not there, Andrew. And I know it's only a couple of instances, but these are only ones that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I know, and you're absolutely right. As we said beforehand, people's suspicions, because you're coming, as we recognize, from a certain point of view, those suspicions, you will use that as evidence that there's a cover-up.
Yeah, it doesn't prove anything, of course. All it proves is that these are not in the files that have been released. There could be 101 reasons why they're not there.
So when a report goes, I'm just trying to think out the procedure. When a report goes missing, can they go back to the people who were mentioned in that report and get them to do a new report? Do they ever do that?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, how would they know it was missing? Who was going to be looking for it? As far as they're aware, it's in the files. You know, and I asked them about it. We don't have a copy. That's it. That's if we don't have a copy. That's as far as it goes.
So your view, and you've quoted a couple of cases, and there are probably other files that are missing.
Yeah, there are.
Your view is it's just human error.
I'm saying that's a possibility. The fact is we don't know. There could be a whole host of reasons why these files are not there. Top of the list for me would be human error. It's just got filed somewhere else, or it's been sent to another. It could have even ended up in the trash. You know, these were paper files. They weren't necessarily huge, great, thick things. There could be, if you think about the Rendlesham Forest incident in 1980, Britain's most famous case. It was witnessed by the Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt. His report on the incident is 1 page. Now, a 1 page, it didn't get lost because he sent a copy to America and to the MOD. But a 1 page report is easily to be filed elsewhere or just end up, you know, mixed up with something else or even in the bin. It's not that difficult if you think about it, Andrew, if we're being reasonable. But on this occasion, of course, it wasn't lost. It's in the MOD files. They denied they ever had it for a lot of years, but it was still there. That's another argument altogether. So, you know, this fantastic series of events that are alleged to have happened in Rendlesham Forest, when Colonel Halt made his report, it was only 1 page, which if you think about it, it's easily for 1 page to go astray.
Sure, but the fact that they denied that they had it, and this one, I think it's worth looking at. And when all we're talking about is you don't have people who have knowledge might be misguided in the same way, in the nicest, politest way about your mother and the fairy. He might have absolutely genuinely believed it was the case, even though you suspect that there wasn't a fairy, but it was her imagination. She got that, and for whatever reason, she convinced herself.
Yeah.
There is a possibility, and you have to say this is the situation, that there may have been a report that they didn't want to get out there, just in the same way you talked about Rendlesham, and they tried to say they denied that first of all. For the ones that were missing, you can understand when people are saying they're deliberately hiding it because they've, first of all, denied the Rendlesham report. There's a pattern of behavior. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll give you, we'll go to the Rendlesham thing. The Colonel Halt wrote his one-page memo. He sent it to his boss because he's an American, so it went to the United States. And because it's on UK soil, a copy also went to the Ministry of Defence. What we didn't have at that time was a Freedom of Information Act here in the UK. We do now, but the Americans did. And I think it was around about 1982, 83, the Americans got a hold of what's called the Halt Memo, and it was released. It made a big noise in the newspapers and so on. I personally wrote to the Ministry of Defence asking for a copy and then denied they had one. We have no documentation on the incident in question. So, okay. A couple of years down the line, I asked them again and they sent me it. They did indeed have a copy, you know, and I have it. So I was the first person to get our own MOD to release the Halt Memo. We already had a copy.
Why do you think, just on that point, why do you think they said no, first of all? Why?
I have no idea. I have no idea. It could well be that the person that worked at the same desk that Nick's going to inherit a few years later just couldn't be bothered. It could be as simple as that.
So then that could be one thing, or they wanted to cover it up.
Keep it quiet. Yeah. Yeah, why not? It's a possibility.
What are the reasons they might want to keep it quiet?
Well, who knows? I mean, people still argue about what happened at Rendlesham. And it's 40 years this December. Events happened over a number of nights. There's a lot of people involved, not just the Colonel. The Colonel also, of course, took his dictaphone out with him and he's talking into it, and you know, and maybe there's something in amongst all this that the MOD didn't want us to know. But what it is, I mean, we have to remember that at the time, the bases that were there, we're talking about Rendlesham Forest. It had two military bases, Woodbridge and Bentwaters. They were American installations with tactical nuclear weapons. So there's a reason why they don't want to be talking about it. And in December 1980, there was Russian tanks gathering on the borders of Poland because the Solidarity movement was, you know, coming to the fore. And the Woodbridge and Bentwaters were on the front line. They also had, I don't know how many squadrons of A-10 tank busters. So they were on the front line. If you remember the Greenham Common protesters, had they known that there was tactical nuclear weapons at Bentwaters, they'd have probably been outside there as well. So there may be other reasons that, and perhaps not as obvious as we would imagine, Andrew, probably not UFO related.
Oh, no, and all we can do, because as you say, with your question everything, all we can do is question it. And any conclusions that you reach are only ever going to be speculation. So people would say, depending on, just we say the different sides of the stories, people say it's a cover-up because it's nuclear, it's a cover-up because it's an American aircraft, it's a cover-up because it was a UFO and it was an alien invasion that they wanted to basically cover up. Any one of those could have been a possibility.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'll give you an example. A British author who lives in the States called Nick Redfern, just written a new book all about Rendlesham. I have read it. Got it here somewhere. Don't ask me to find it, Andrew. I've got tons of books.
I wanted to find it, but we can do that in another episode. It'd be good.
But Nick's theory is that this was a military test, unsuspecting test on the security at that installation. And so the people involved had no idea that they were being tested. And he you know, I won't go into it in that much detail, but Nick said they had a whole array of exotic material that they could use to trick the military airmen that were involved, including hallucinogens that were released into the atmosphere. So it was a military test, you know, and that's the latest theory. But that was what's interesting. That was one of the theories that came out very early on. Sure. When we first learned about it.
As you say, and this is what I'm really keen to do in this series, we're going to drill down to each of those. And you're brilliant because you've accumulated all of these different theories and information. and we can look at it and we can ask, because we know a lot of the people involved, we can get them in the same way as you might do with a court case. And, you know, my background as a lawyer, we can have a look at that sort of side and drill down into that evidence. Because at the moment, what we've got is a lot of speculation. Whenever you don't have a clear answer, all that we can do is to speculate. And when you speculate, we then say, okay, let's look at the evidence of that. Let's work out why people might be saying something. That's always a great way of approaching any witness. Why would they be saying that? Yeah, in the same way as people might be embellishing the truth because it makes them sound good. They might want to turn around because they've got a theory about aliens and therefore they're looking for that evidence. They've got cover-ups because there have been cover-ups in the past. All of these things we can dig deeper into. And throughout this series, and we're going to get you back on a regular sort of basis to dig down into those and look at those in details. Those, I think that's the best way to approach it, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no smoking gun in any of those files. So you have to amass the information from wherever you get it, and you draw your own conclusion. It's like Fox Mulder. In fact, I've said this to Nick, I was also called the real Fox Mulder because me and my wife used to go and investigate together. So he didn't have a Scully, I did, you know.
I love this. Would the real Fox Mulder stand up? I love it. It's got to be good. Well, Philip, it's been an absolute delight. We will get you back. We're going to look at Rendlesham. We're going to look at the alien autopsy. We're going to look at everything. And if people have got a view, do write to us at ufo@octopustv.com. That's ufo@octopustv.com. And we will get you on as well. But for now, Philip Mantle, thank you very much for being my guest.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.